Booby traps, it turns out, aren't just fictional plot twists in movies, they're as old as history. Some 4,500 years ago, an Egyptian pharaoh protected his final resting place in the Great Pyramid of Giza with collapsing stones. Over 2,000 years ago, a Chinese emperor had his grave guarded with automatically firing crossbows. More recently, the Germans planned to kill Winston Churchill with a bar of exploding chocolate. Fortunately, that plot was foiled. These booby traps from history may sound like something from an adventure movie, but they were 100% real. Real historical booby traps that could be straight from an Indiana Jones movie. It was in 1994 that a Mexican archaeologist called Fanny Lopez Jimenez made an extraordinary discovery at Palenque in Mexico. Palenque was the site of the magnificent Mayan city of La Campa, which thrived from around 600 to 900 AD. What Jimenez came across was a tomb hidden deep in a temple, a grave that belonged to a long-dead Mayan noblewoman. What's more, the Red Queen's tomb is extraordinarily full of wealth and riches for a female Maya ruler. Sakbu was laid to rest wearing elaborate jewelry, including a headband of apple green jade, a green stone and shell headdress, and a malachite mask with obsidian eyes. But her tomb also had a much more dangerous addition. The tomb of Pharaoh Amenhotep III lies at perhaps the most famous of the ancient world's archaeological sites, Egypt's Valley of the Kings. Amenhotep ruled his kingdom for nearly 4 decades some 3,400 years ago. French engineers attached to Napoleon's invading army discovered his tomb in the late 1790s. It was fully excavated by the famed British Egyptologist Howard Carter in 1915. Amenhotep was a great builder, and his sprawling palace at Malkata lay close to his funerary temple, the largest ever built according to the BBC. A network of canals linked the palace and tomb to the River Nile. Fascinatingly, his monumental mausoleum included a variety of booby traps to foil any would-be looters attracted by the treasure buried with the pharaoh. The idea of a gun that will automatically fire at anyone or anything has likely been around since at least the 15th century. But it was in the 17th century that these weapons were brought into use in graveyards. You might wonder why a cemetery would need such protection, since it is by definition filled with dead people. Another reason to break open a grave was to loot any valuables such as jewelry that might have been deposited in a coffin with the dearly departed. Relatives of the deceased did not take kindly to grave robbing, hence the need for deadly protection. The cemetery guns themselves were simple enough. Of all the great monuments that the ancient Egyptians left to the world's heritage, the Great Pyramid of Giza is perhaps the most magnificent of all. Standing by 2 smaller pyramids, today it soars 482 feet into the desert sky, having lost a couple of hundred feet to erosion over the millennia. With each corner aligned to a cardinal compass point, it was built as a mausoleum for the pharaoh Khufu, who died in 2584 BC. Passages inside this marvel of ancient engineering know-how and hard physical labor lead to the main burial room, the king's chamber. One thing that's missing from there is Khufu's body and any grave goods he was buried with. These were presumably looted by grave robbers. Although thieves managed to penetrate to the inner depths of the pyramid, it seems there may have been a booby trap installed to try and top them. Oak Island lies off the Atlantic coast of Canada's Nova Scotia, one of the 300 islands that make up the archipelago in Mahon Bay. But it's not just any old island, at least according to legend. The tale of Oak Island goes back to a teenager called Daniel McGuinness. In 1795, something about the speck of land, just 140 acres in area, piqued his interest. What the three found astonished them. A 100-foot deep shaft appeared in the ground, and it was clearly man-made. About every 10 feet of its depth there was a wooden platform. But before the boys could explore this strange excavation, it suddenly flooded with water. It was almost as if this was by design. An effort to keep out unwanted intruders. Although the Viet Cong sometimes used troops in full-scale attacks, they also often turned to guerrilla tactics against their South Vietnamese and American opponents. And this included the frequent use of booby traps, one of the most obnoxious of which was the bamboo whip trap. The bamboo whip would be bent back and tied in place in a strategic position on a trail. A wire would be attached to the strip which would release it when an American or North Vietnamese soldier tripped it as they patrolled through the jungle on foot. A U.S. Marine document, Viet Cong Mines and Booby Traps, described what would happen next. As bitter and brutal as any 20th century conflict, the Vietnam War spawned some truly unpleasant booby traps. One of those used by the Viet Cong involved an animal that lives in the Vietnamese jungles, the bamboo pit viper. These snakes grow up to 40 inches long and have a highly poisonous bite. The Viet Cong were great tunnel builders during the war, and they had their own special way of making them lethally dangerous. The GIS who searched these underground complexes were known as tunnel rats. They had to proceed with extreme caution. The Viet Cong would often trap a snake in a hollow bamboo branch, ready to bite any unwary searcher. Another of the items in the repertoire of booby traps that the Viet Cong used against American and South Vietnamese troops during the Vietnam War was the punji stick. This was a sharpened bamboo stake which was used in various types of booby trap. For the Viet Cong, these punji sticks were ideal guerrilla warfare weapons, as the bamboo itself grows everywhere in great quantity in Vietnam, and stakes themselves can be cut, fashioned, and even placed by women or children. The only way to effectively counter the punji stick was to wear boots with a steel plate inserted in the sole. The Bafin Temple is part of the huge complex of buildings that make up the magnificent Angkor Thom site in Cambodia. The temple, with its layered style and grand staircases, was built in the mid-11th century by a Khmer ruler with the tongue-twisting name of Udayadat Yavarman II. The entire structure of Bafin was unstable, as it had been built on sandy soil. The building was entirely dismantled and then put back together on strengthened foundations. After the painstaking and lengthy restoration, the temple was finally opened to the public in 2011. There are legends about secret tunnels hidden in America's Northwest in New Mexico, Arizona, and elsewhere. In part, the legends derive from tales of the days when the U.S. Army were pursuing the Native American leader Geronimo and his warriors across rough terrain. It was said that Geronimo and his men sometimes seemed to simply disappear from the landscape. This tale of Spanish-built tunnels extends to Puerto Rico and Mexico. The legend also relates that the Spanish may have hidden some of the precious metals they found in these passages. But they weren't content to leave their loot unprotected, so they made booby traps to guard the hidden gold and silver. Much of World War I on Europe's Western Front was a prolonged stalemate. One side would grab a few hundred feet of land in an assault, only to be pushed back to their starting point by a counterattack a few days later. This meant that trenches would be occupied by the British and French for a few days before being retaken by the Germans. Training Circular 21, preserved by the National World War I Museum, was subtitled Ruses and Snares of the Enemy when retreating. This instructional manual gave examples of the type of booby traps that German soldiers might leave as they retreated. The step of a staircase is put in contact with a nail which touches the primer of a mine, was how one deadly trap was described. The Emperor Qin Shi Huang was the first ruler to preside over a unified China. He died in 210 BC, but before he did he had made extraordinarily elaborate preparations for his tomb. When it was discovered in the 1970s, it was one of the most amazing finds ever made from the ancient world. Farmers discovered this incredible cemetery for just one man as they dug a well in 1974. Eventually, 7,000 of the terracotta warriors would be excavated, along with a variety of military equipment, including spears, bows, and arrows. There were also swords which Britannica tells us are still shiny and sharp today. As just noted, Emperor Qin Shi Huang's tomb was famously surrounded by a 7,000-strong army of life-size terracotta warriors, standing ready for combat. This imposing force faced east, the direction from which the emperor's enemies tended to come. They were complemented by a stable full of horses whose skeletons have been excavated, plus bronze chariots. As noted above, one way he booby-trapped his tomb to protect it from looters was a moat filled with deadly mercury. But that wasn't the end of it. Chinese chronicler Sima Qian wrote a work in 94 BC called the Shiji. It described a second method of deterring anyone who dared enter the emperor's tomb complex. Some of the most cunning types of booby trap are those that look just like an everyday object but have an extremely unpleasant sting in the tail. That was exactly a tactic used by the Germans during World War II. One plot involved an attempt to assassinate Britain's wartime leader Winston Churchill. Fortunately, the Germans never found a way to get the deadly candy into Churchill's hands. But they also designed other explosive devices disguised as everything from motor oil cans to vacuum flasks and lumps of coal. Then there was a military mess tin filled with the traditional British dish of sausages and mashed potato. As German forces found themselves on the retreat in the later years of World War II, they left behind devious weapons to slow down the Allies. They transformed a number of seemingly harmless farmhouses and apartments into death traps, with objects as seemingly harmless as crooked picture frames. Allied servicemen had no idea that these frames were wired to hidden explosives, like hand grenades. After they straightened one of these frames just a bit, the wire would yank out the bomb's safety pin. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe.